Good morning. This lesson then is the first of a series of three lessons in which we'll be looking at the extent of the nature of support for Hitler and the Nazi movement. Okay, and the first lesson, today's lesson, will look specifically at the people's community, what the Nazis called the Volksgemeinschaft. Okay, so just to give you the bigger picture, three lessons as follows. So there's today's, the people's community. The next lesson we'll look at Hitler's popularity and the nature of support for the Nazi regime, support and opposition. And then we will look at, do a lesson on which will look at the extent of support for Hitler from the different sectors of the population, whether that be social classes such as the middle classes and working classes, or other sectors of the population such as young people, women, religious groups, etc. Okay, so three lessons to cover this topic. Now, this particular topic, this collective group of three, is a very important topic because it actually could appear in any section of the exam paper, although specifically and majorly it's section C that we're talking about. You can use this knowledge in section A or section B. So, for example, a section A question, here's an example of one, which is from the specimen paper, and you can see the indicative content in the mark scheme. There was a question, assess the value of source 2 for revealing the approaches of the new Nazi regime to potential opposition in 1933 and its success in suppressing it. You will probably remember that particular question. We used it as a model when we did a lesson on how to answer section A questions. That was the source by Hafner. But if you reflect back and think about that particular source, it was about support and opposition to the Nazi regime. So therefore, learning from these three lessons could have helped you answer that particular question. Obviously, section B is the depth study. Now, the depth study focus the third depth study, A New Reich 1933 to 35, focuses specifically on the first 3 years of Hitler's rule. But again, there are some examples of questions there that you could get. Okay, in section B, to what extent did Hitler's power rest on consensual dictatorship? Consensual dictatorship basically means that his dictatorship was supported by popular consent, in other words, by popular support. Okay, so that's all obviously about support and opposition. Then you've got another one here, which is in the revision guide as well. Nazi popularity in Germany between 1933 and 1935 was largely dependent on propaganda. So the proposition of that question is about the nature of propaganda and the effectiveness of propaganda, but the topic itself is about Nazi popularity. It's about support and opposition, how far people supported the Nazi regime. And then there's another one, also from the revision guide, to what extent was Nazi rule genuinely popular in Germany between 1933 and 1935. Okay, so although our three lessons that we're doing here will focus on the whole of the Nazi period, 1933 to 45, you can use this material for a section B question if one comes up about Hitler's rule of Germany 1933 to 35. Okay. But the main reason we're doing these three lessons, the key thrust where it's absolutely essential, is the section C, which is the breadth study. Okay, now you remember the breadth study, you've got two questions on the paper. Usually one of them is on the economy, covering the whole 120 years, and the other one is usually on society, covering the whole 120 years. And whichever one you choose, you've got to make sure that you have breadth, that you cover the 120 years. So assuming that there will be a question on society, which there usually is, covering 120 years, somewhere within that you're going to have to be writing about society during the Nazi period, 1933 to 1945. Okay, so we so far, so if you imagine a sort of timeline, 1871 all the way through to 1990. Okay, and we have basically reached, with lessons we've covered so far, up to 1932, up to the end of the Weimar Republic. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be looking at 1933 to 1945. We're going to sort of take it up to 1945 over these three lessons, okay, because we're building up that picture of social change in Germany over 120 years at intervals over the 2 years that we're doing this course. So a quick look at the questions there that have appeared in various places, mainly the revision guide, but also, as you can see, you've got the second specimen paper, the first specimen paper, and also the 2018 actual paper. Okay, all of these questions are section C type questions. Okay, and all of them cover the whole 120 years. Okay, you can see that very clearly there. That's the nature of this. Okay, but within that 120 years, you're going to have to talk about the Nazi period, 1933 to 45. Okay, so you've got a question about the position of women. You've got a question about the German urban working classes. You've got a question about social mobility. You've got a question about the rise of the urban working class. You've got a question about the landowning elites, and you've got a question about the white collar workers. Okay, and so all of those are asking you to understand about their attitudes, their and their development, okay, and their importance to how they contributed to German society. Okay, so as I said in the previous slide, we have covered up to 1932. So this is just simply the lessons, a reminder that we initially did a lesson called The Social Structure of Imperial Germany. We then did a lesson called The Growth of the Urban Working Class. We then did one on the rural classes, 1871 to 1932. We then did one on the artisans, the white collar workers, and the urban working classes. And then more recently, we did a lesson on the changing role of women. Okay, so 5 lessons we've done so far, and the next 3 lessons that we're doing here will bring your knowledge up to the year 1945. Okay, and then in year 13 we will sporadically at intervals over the course of year 13 we'll do some more lessons that will take your knowledge from 1945 up to 1990. Okay, so that's sort of giving you again the big picture. Okay, so you can see we've been doing a whole series of lessons here that have been focusing just on 1933 to 35. Okay, the takeover of power, that's the section B knowledge requirement, and we will continue with that when we do those 2 lessons there. Just to finish that off, the depth study 33 to 35, we have to look at racial policy. Okay, but what we're doing here with these 3 lessons, and what we're going to do here with these, forget that. What we're going to do here with these 3 lessons is we're looking at society. Okay, we're looking at section C, as I just said. Okay, so the first 3 lessons, and we're largely going to focus in on an S.J. Lee essay. Okay, so it is really important that you read that S.J. Lee essay. Okay, over the course of the time where I'm delivering these 3 lessons, make sure you read the S.J. Lee essay. My notes are largely, not exclusively, but are largely taken from the S.J. Lee essay. So the notes for these slideshows and for this video are primarily taken from that essay, but you need to read the essay yourself. Remember, the whole purpose of reading the original writing is to understand how historians write. That helps you internalize the vocabulary that historians use, the way they argue their cases and so on. Okay. Now, in terms of the textbook, which obviously you keep at home, and I ask you to use for flip learning tasks, etc. The material from the textbook is very bitty. Okay, there is a section for today's lesson on the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, page 125 to 127. So have a look at that. Okay, and then for the next two lessons, it is bitty. You've got to kind of dot around to the different pages. The different social classes are on different pages. Women is dealt with. Women in Nazi Germany is dealt with in a section in itself. Okay, so as I say, the Stephen J. Lee, chapter 6, okay, contains 2 essays, and the first one is especially relevant for these 3 lessons. Okay, how extensive was support for Hitler and Nazism? Okay, that isn't to say, though, that you shouldn't look at the second essay. The second essay is also relevant because it's about negative support, in a sense. It's about the other way around. It's about the opposition and resistance to the Nazi regime, 1933-35, the reasons why people didn't like the regime. Okay, so although we tend to focus in on the points from the first essay, simply for the amount of time we have in lessons to cover what we need to cover, it is important that you read the second essay and make your own notes from the second essay, so follow up from that independently. And then an additional follow-up, again, keep going back to Noakes and Pridham. Really emphasised from the previous lessons, chapter 6. Now there's another chapter in Noakes and Pridham, chapter 17, which I'll upload for you. And it's called The Regime and the People. It's actually a very short chapter, and it is specifically about what we're doing in today's lesson, the Volksgemeinschaft. Okay, so, and it provides an excellent summary of what that term Volksgemeinschaft means and how Hitler aimed to create a people's community. And it also is very good on looking at the weaknesses and contradictions of the Volksgemeinschaft, which we'll talk about in today's lesson. So action required, notice I'm saying required there, okay? Make sure you do this. It's only a short chapter, okay? Read that chapter alongside my own notes to the chapter, okay? So you'll see my notes called The Regime and the People, notes from chapter 17, which I'll upload to the area for today's lesson, okay? So read the chapter alongside my own notes. It's only a short chapter, but read the actual chapter as well as my notes. And then play the YouTube video cast in which I walk and talk you through my notes to that chapter, okay? So that's kind of like a supplement for today's lesson. And you can access the video cast by clicking on the link in this particular slideshow, okay? So just go to this slideshow, which you can download. Otherwise, you will find it in the playlist. Okay, it's in the Germany 1933 to 39 playlist on my YouTube channel, and you'll see it in there as well. Okay, about there, ready to start? Yes, we are. So lesson 1, the people's community, aka the Volksgemeinschaft. That's a German word for it. Try to use that word, the Volksgemeinschaft, when you're writing about it. Notice the spelling of that word as well, okay? Volksgemein, the SCH, Volksgemeinschaft. Anything with the word Volks translates as people's, so the Volkswagen, the car, the people's car, okay? Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. So there are the notes for this lesson, attempts to create a Volksgemeinschaft, okay? That you'll see these same notes on the slideshow as I go through now. And there's the mind map, okay? Usual approach. So we'll start off with the terminology. Very brief in a nutshell here. There's just this particular strand, have a look at what we're saying. Okay, so in a nutshell, nothing new. You know this. We've touched upon it time and again. A key goal of the Nazi dictatorship was to restore the spirit of 1914, okay, in which divisions were overcome and all classes were united behind the concept of a national community. I mean, you know the word, we used that when we did that at the time, the Bergfriede, the coming together of all Germans at the beginning of World War One. That very famous picture where a photographer called Heinrich Hoffmann, standing in the crowds or above the crowds in Munich, took a photograph of thousands of people gathering in the square at Munich, waiting to enlist. Taken on the beginning of August 1914, captured that sort of feeling of people of all social classes in Germany, rich and poor, all uniting, coming together, because World War One had started, and Germany had been a deeply divided community in the years up to World War One. Again, think about that. We did that way back at the beginning of year 12, with the growth of the social democratic movement, etc., and the fears that generated, and the social divisions that existed in Germany in the first years of the 20th century. And then suddenly an announcement was made, we're at war with Russia and France. And people forgot their differences. And what war did was create unity. And there, in the middle of that crowd, just by sheer chance, you could see Adolf Hitler. Okay, a young man, never found his place in life. Just recently, a year before, had crossed from his home country, Austria, into Germany, and looking for a place to belong, and he was there waiting to enlist. Okay, so that was not only was it a coincidence that we've actually found that photograph. I should have put this in the slideshow, but I have shown it you before. But not only was it a coincidence that, you know, astonishing look, we found a photograph with Hitler in it before he was famous, but also that moment that photograph was taken was actually the great moment in Hitler's life. It was a formative moment in Hitler's life when his views were being shaped. Okay, and then after the war, when he entered politics and formed or joined the German Workers' Party and turned it into the Nazi party, the NSDAP, from the very beginning, it was driven by this central principle that when the Nazi movement takes power, and it did take power in 1933, our aim is to restore the spirit of 1914. So, again, because Germany in the Weimar era became very divided again, all those social divisions opened up, and even worse in many ways. And Hitler's view was the purpose, the role of the Nazi party was to bring the country back together again. And of course, it's no coincidence that what brought the country together in 1914 was war. And here, Hitler, taking power in 1933, wants to bring the country back together again. And of course, in effect, although World War II didn't break out for another 6 years, in effect, he ran the country on a war footing. There was always enemies. Okay, he mobilised the population. It began with the communists. He needed enemies to pull the country together again. So that's the sort of idea of what the national community was. So pulling back, just so you can then pause, have a look at some of the detail there. Point number 2, the idea of a people's community, it wasn't new. Okay. That's the definition. All aspects of German society would be united into one communal body. Okay, it's not communism. There still will be social classes. Okay, be very clear about that. Communism eradicates social classes. Wealth differences of wealth are theoretically ironed out, whereas Hitler's concept of a people's community is people don't let their differences of wealth matter. that there still will be working class and middle class, but we will pull together because we're all German. Okay, it's our Germanness that creates our unity. Okay, so the idea actually predated the Nazis. It wasn't invented by the Nazis. Okay, and when historians look at the literature and people who spoke about a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community, often it was written in almost like a sort of spiritual sense. Okay, always very vague, and that there was some sort of unique connection between Germans in respect to their nation. So nothing new. And often the literature of the people's community phrased it in a way that there was a unique connection between the blood of the people and the soil, the land that they existed on. It's what we call Blut und Boden, blood and soil ideology. That a vague sense, or a sense that the Germanness that makes all the German people come together, it's the bloodline of the German people, and the strength of that bloodline comes in particular from the soil that we exist on, and there was almost like a mystical sense of back before the Industrial Revolution, when the society was more rural and we were closer to nature because people lived in villages, not in towns and cities, that we didn't have these social differences, we didn't have these divisions that are dividing the Germans up into working class and middle class, and making us all forget our Germanness. Okay, so often it was linked to that. So a key goal for the Nazi dictatorship was to deal with this. So as you say, pre-1933 society was deeply fractured, divided. Okay, we've done loads of that, so see previous notes. It's been an ongoing theme all the way through. Nazi propaganda exploited and promoted the idea of shared loyalty in the nation and to Hitler. Okay, so Nazi propaganda, yeah, so there's our sort of like fractured German society, broken into the working classes, the middle classes and the upper classes, and with sort of tensions that are dividing the German people. And what Nazi propaganda did is it took hold of this and said, we are all Germans, we must work together, we must love each other for our Germanness. Okay, and Hitler at the top embodies Germanness. Okay, so we all come together, and the embodiment of Hitler, the ultimate German who is sacrificing his personal happiness to make Germany great again, is the sort of metaphor for what the nation should be doing, coming together and working together to overcome these deep divisions from the Weimar era. So that links to the next point. Hitler was therefore inseparable from the nation. Belief in Hitler meant belief in the nation. So by consequence, if you disagreed with Hitler, you were a traitor to the nation. Okay? So it was almost like a fundamental obligation. Your attitude towards Hitler reflected, if your attitude was wrong, you were weakening the nation. Okay? So if you did not support Hitler, you placed yourself outside the people's community. So that's the kind of like terminology that we're talking about. Now let's develop it a bit more. So how Nazi propaganda portrayed the Volksgemeinschaft. So in a nutshell, the Nazis portrayed the democratic Weimar years as the worst years of German history. Okay. Germany became divided. There were lots of political parties, each representing different sectors of the population. This is what democracy had done. Too much freedom, and the German people ended up grouping into different groups. Some Germans, the working classes, followed the Social Democrats. The middle classes followed a multitude of different political parties, the Centre Party, the German People's Party, the German Nationalist Party, and so on. And all of this weakened Germany because Germans were turning against each other during the Weimar era. And the Weimar era was riddled with problems, starting with the Treaty of Versailles, and then the hyperinflation, and then, of course, the Great Depression and mass unemployment. But through it all, Germans lost confidence in the system, okay, because it was weakening the nation. That's the sort of message of Nazi propaganda. So by contrast, when the Nazis came in, they overcame those divisions. They created strong, decisive government. The opposite of the Weimar era, in which there were weak coalition governments that often fell apart, often in less than a year. They created national unity. And one of the key reasons they were able to do this, a bit like 1914, what brought the Germans together? There was an enemy outside. Okay, and in 1914, the enemy was the Russians and the French, and then, of course, Britain came into the war a few days later. So an external enemy was good for Germany because it brought Germans together. So in Hitler's view, the same concept applies. There needed to be an enemy. Okay, so what the Nazi regime in their propaganda did is they clearly focused in on threats to the German people, and especially communists and Jews. Okay, and think about what we've done about the takeover of power. No time wasted. The day after Hitler became Chancellor, he gave that big speech, the appeal to the German people. And of course, it was, there is a grave threat, it is communism. We must overcome communism. And that way in which he whipped up fear of communism with the Reichstag fire and the Reichstag fire decree and the Enabling Act, all of that came out of the fact that the Nazis brilliantly persuaded the German people there was a grave threat to the existence of Germany from the Communist Party. And broadening it out to the Social Democratic Party as well. Okay, so that's what that's about. So let's just pull in and have a look at the information. So Nazi propaganda portrayed the Weimar Republic as the worst years in German history. Republican politicians betrayed, starting with Aber and etc., betrayed the German people by signing the Versailles Treaty, by the surrender of November, and then the Versailles Treaty in June the next year. And then Republican politicians created a fractured and weak political system. Okay, we say, yeah, democracy is a fair and equal system. And that's our belief, fundamental belief as Britons today, that we don't see pluralism, multiple political parties, as a negative. We see it as important, that we can live freely to express our different views. But that's not the way the Nazis viewed the Weimar era. They saw it as a fractured and weak political system that accentuated the divisions in society. And by contrast, then, the Nazis swiftly brought about strong central government which created national unity. The Nazis claimed to have restored national pride, that their leader Hitler, as we have seen in the recent lessons, stood up against the Versailles Treaty. He was able to revise the treaty by standing up and arguing with the Allies that the treaty was unjust. And certainly up until 1939, he was able to have the treaty revised without going to war. Okay, and that did a huge amount of building up popular support for the Nazi movement. Okay, the German people felt pride in what Hitler was doing. Of course, they didn't want war, and we know that Hitler did want war, but of course that was kept hidden from the German people. But that's something else we'll come on to when that eventually happened. So here you got this leader in Adolf Hitler who embodied the hopes and dreams of the German nation. Okay, it's all about overcoming the humiliation of World War One. But say it's not about revenge, because the German people did not want another war, and Hitler did not want to present himself as a leader who wanted another war. If Hitler represented himself to the German people as vote for me because I'm going to take you into a Second World War to get all our land back, nobody would have voted for him. He presented himself as a leader who was going to create national unity and revise the terms of the Treaty of Versailles peacefully by being a strong leader on the national stage. Okay, so that's how the achievements were presented. So class divisions and preoccupation with status would be overcome. Germans would now, their role was to identify with their nation, not with their social class or occupation. Again, we've covered that. So when pluralism was abolished in 1933 and Germany and Hitler created a one-party state, so the other political parties were dissolved, Hitler didn't present that as a bad thing. He said this is a necessary thing. If we have just the one party, the Nazi party, that will create national unity. We will pull together. That it is bad that we've all been dividing our loyalties to different political parties. Okay, we must therefore no longer be saying I am a working class or I am a middle class person, because that's divisive. We say I am a German person. Okay, you are beneath it still working class or middle class, but that doesn't matter. You are Germans. So that's what the Nazis brought about, and then shaped by that clearly articulated concept of exclusion. That, like the spirit of 1914, the best way in Hitler's mind of creating unity is sharply focus people on groups that threaten us as the German people. Okay, so in Hitler's view, Germanness was defined by racial characteristics and by political outlook. Okay, that defined a good national comrade. Okay, what they called a Volksgenossen. A Volksgenossen was a member of the national community. If you were a good German, then you were of the correct racial blood. Okay, and we'll come on to that complex topic about race, because Hitler defined nationality not purely in terms of your language and your passport, but he defined it in terms of the bloodline that ran, the blood that ran through your veins, but also your political outlook. Okay, and as I say, if you, for example, clung onto the old ways and you were a working class person, you hate the middle classes, then you're no longer, in Hitler's mind, a member of the national community, because you're thinking the wrong way. A good member of the national community, if you were working class, you would love the middle class people, because we're all Germans. We all pull together. And the same way around. The middle class people should love the working class people, because we're all Germans. If you start to identify just with your social class, then you are basically weakening the national community. So your political outlook was really important. Okay, so what that basically meant was that people with undesirable racial characteristics, such as the Jews, were outside the national community. People with strong political views from the old world, e.g. socialists or supporters of democracy, were outside the national community. And in particular, communists were the initial target, because they were, of course, international in their views. Okay, workers of the world unite. How far? I mean, that the ultimate way of being outside the nation is you're identifying with workers of the world. And Jews and communists in Hitler's head were the same. Okay, it was during this period that Hitler basically began to identify Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, as the headquarters of the world Jewish movement, because Jews, like communists, are international. They in Hitler's mind, they are a group of people that do not have their own nation. Now, of course, since World War II, there is a Jewish nation, Israel, created in 1947. Before World War II, go back into hundreds of years, there had been a Jewish homeland, but Jews had been scattered around the world, and they were a race without a nation. They were therefore truly international, okay, Jews in every single country of the world. But in Hitler's sort of diseased mind, that sort of like was evidence of the fact that they were a threat. Because they didn't have their own nation, they were jealous of people who did have their own nation, and therefore they conspired to bring about the downfall of nations out of jealousy because they didn't have their own nation, that sort of thing. And because Jews and communists were both international groups, and because many of the Russian leaders who created communism in 1917, the Soviet leaders were of Jewish background, in Hitler's mind, they became the same thing. Jews and communists were disease-like, they were poisonous, they were harmful to the strength of the Volksgemeinschaft. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So, most Germans could relate in some way to this idea of the Volksgemeinschaft. So, in a nutshell, the Nazi portrayal of the Volksgemeinschaft was deliberately vague. Emphasis there on the word deliberately vague. Okay, so it was constantly referred to in Hitler's speeches, and the leading Nazis constantly talked about the people's community and loyalty and Germans standing together. And that vagueness meant that most Germans were able to identify with it in some ways. Okay, not the Jews and the communists, but most Germans, whether you were middle class or working class, or whether you were young or old, or male or female, or Catholic or Protestant, most Germans, when they heard this argument, could buy into it to some extent. It worked, okay? And that concept is called consent, okay? That Nazi power, Hitler's power in particular, to a large extent came out of the fact that most Germans across all social classes and all ages and all faiths, to some extent at some time or other, thought, yeah, I can see what Hitler's saying. They could buy in to this sort of argument. And undoubtedly it had a universal appeal, particularly in the first 3 or 4, 5 years, okay? But we need to be very, very careful here, because at some point or other, most Germans could have been persuaded that Hitler and the Nazis were doing some good, but it was a very, very fluid position. And there were moments in the 1930s where Hitler's popularity really went downhill, or particularly the popularity of the Nazi Party. There were key moments. Late 1934, I mean, there was a crisis as the build-up to the Night of the Long Knives. People were losing confidence in the Nazi movement. In 1935, the following year, in the summer of 1935, there was, with the shortage of foreign exchange and what we call the guns v butter crisis, which we'll talk about, that caused Nazi popularity to go downhill. And again, in 1937 and 38, it was a very sort of up and down thing. But likewise, there was a sort of constant there. Certainly up until 1938. I mean, it really went downhill after 1938 because German people did not want war, but by that point it was very difficult to object or to even criticise Hitler. But there was to some extent buy-in from many, many social classes to some extent. So let's have a look at what the key points are here. So a key strength was its vagueness. Okay, the first point we covered. So, for example, big business, farm owners, the military. We've already covered that, haven't we? Okay. On the whole, supported the creation of a dictatorship. Yeah. And we've looked at that. The sort of, they were the groups that backed Hitler into power, because they felt the Weimar democracy was undermining them. So they gave Hitler backing. for a centralised dictatorship. We'll look at the Protestants and the Catholic churches in the lesson, not next lesson, but the one after. Okay, but they basically, both Protestants and Catholics, supported the crushing of communism. Okay, and the middle classes generally believed that Hitler was creating a more orderly society. Okay, it was less liberal. They'd lost the vote. There was no longer multiple political parties to choose from. But many middle classes would say, yeah, well, perhaps that's a worthwhile sacrifice, because what the Nazis have done have created a bit of law and order on the streets, that there was a desperately uncertain time before Hitler took power when we were under grave threat from the communists. And also, many middle classes sort of like were genuinely attracted by Hitler's promise to recreate traditional values based on the values of the countryside and the village and etc. That they almost saw the Weimar era as this sort of big social experiment that had gone wrong. Okay, and again, we've covered that in previous lessons, that there was too much liberalism. You know, women in particular, for example, were very, very deeply divided. Some women, you know, had become, you know, gone to the big cities of Berlin and were clubbing it, and by the concepts of the time, that divided many women who felt that women should not be behaving that particular way, and so on. Okay, so Germans across all social classes supported the end of a political system that they felt had become divisive. They'd become disenchanted with it. And again, universally, people despised the Treaty of Versailles, which they saw as unjust, unfair. And of course, to a large extent, even the Allies themselves came to realise that the Treaty of Versailles had gone too far. Again, a complicated debate that, but certainly by the terms of the evidence of the time, there was a growing realisation that the Treaty of Versailles had been unfair on Germany, and Hitler latched onto that. And because that was universally felt by the German people, remember, they didn't want another war, but they wanted a strong leader who would stand up and persuade and convince the Allies that the treaty needed to be revised. And Hitler was seen to be the person who could do that, and he was the person who did that. Yeah, he overcame the restrictions on the size of the military and introduced conscription, and was able to build up a large army, which the German people thought was for defensive purposes, because Hitler knew it was going to be for a different reason. And then, of course, remilitarized the Rhineland without war, incorporated Austria into Germany without war, incorporated the Sudetenland into Germany without war. All of these successes built up popularity. Okay, and the final strand. So the importance then of this word consent. It's a word you need to be using, okay? So in a nutshell, Nazi propaganda focused strongly on consent. In other words, it was the duty of good Germans to selflessly put the nation before their individual happiness, okay? Which would ensure that the desperately divisive Weimar years in which democracy had weakened Germany would never return. Okay? And that argument that your support, your selflessness will create unity, which will create national strength, was a very, very persuasive argument, and it brought buy-in, okay, and that's what we've got to look at, okay. I think it's so important. There's often a misconception from GCSE, sometimes through badly written textbooks, even at GCSE. So, which is as follows. So, unlock your mind from this, okay. People badly taught history would often say, oh, the German people followed Hitler because they were frightened of him, okay? Because Hitler used terror, and Hitler's dictatorship was built on fear, okay? Now, to some extent, that is true. There was fear. Ordinary Germans did know that if they stepped out of line, that the consequences for them would be frightening. They could end up in concentration camps. But what we're saying here is it's much, much more subtle and nuanced than that, that beneath it all, there was a great deal of consent, okay, of popular support for Hitler and the Nazi regime. Now, it fluctuated, it changed, and certainly after 1938, and certainly when the war began in 1939, much of that consent was lost, okay? But certainly in the beginning, in the early years, it was a key feature that we need to know and understand, okay? So, what are the key points? So it's a key aspect of the Volksgemeinschaft. It's a powerful, uniting force because it encouraged Germans to support the Nazis for many different reasons. All Germans did not support every single aspect of the regime. That's what I mean by nuanced. It means that it's not black and white. There's lots of greys, okay? It's not if you imagine it as a graph, it's not a sort of straight line. There's lots of ups and downs. So all Germans did not support every single aspect of the Nazi regime, okay? Every German would have a reason to not like Hitler, and it would be a different reason from the next German, and it may change over time. But likewise, most Germans supported some aspects that they believed were positive. Okay. German people were repeatedly told through propaganda that their fanatical support for the nation and their willingness to sacrifice individual happiness was the key to a strong, united Germany. So the point we're making here is this sort of idea of consent and a people's community was a focal point of propaganda messages. Goebbels in his speeches and his radio programs, the literature of the Third Reich, the paintings of the Third Reich, the cinema of the Third Reich, the theatre of the Third Reich, all in different ways subtly put this message across about the people's community. It was reflected, we see it in the whole culture of the Third Reich, okay? A subtle brainwashing was there, that the message being subtly put across that a good German would stand behind the leader and would see every other German as their friend. So those older, more selfish personal divisions based on class and status from the Weimar era and from the Second Reich, those were the values that created division, and those are the values that had to be removed, and there had to be a new sacrifice, a new value of self-sacrifice, okay, personal faith in Hitler, and that Hitler was the living embodiment of the German nation, a man who had selflessly sacrificed his own personal happiness to save the nation. And that's almost like that was a sort of way in which was put across that Hitler was like a saviour, taking the German people to a promised land of happiness. And you probably sense from the language there almost like a messiah, a messiah. He was not in a Christian sense, but there was a spiritual sense of Nazism, and not, and again, be very clear, not in a Christian spiritual sense. There was nothing good about Nazism. It was a fundamentally evil movement because the values at the heart of it were to eradicate the weak. But nevertheless, it projected itself more as a religious type movement, a spiritual movement, than a political movement. Because what it demanded of the followers was faith, unthinking faith. Okay? It didn't want people to think. It was just surrender your willingness to think for yourselves and just follow and feel good with the leader. So oppositional, and there's that emphasis in faith. Oppositional voices were excluded and portrayed as outsiders, motivated by the selfish desire to weaken the nation. Okay, so anybody who dared to criticize this was then targeted as being selfish, and therefore you are a traitor. So these people could not be part of the national community. They were a danger. So yes, fundamentally Jews and communists, but anybody who spoke out suddenly was branded as being outside. Even cracking a joke about Hitler could expose yourself to being branded as being outside of the national community, the people's community. Okay, so there we go. There's our in a nutshell. Relatively fewer words than previous ones, but hopefully that's giving you a good bedrock for the next two lessons, where we'll start to get more into the details about the types of policies and how this played out with the different Germans. So the next lesson will look in particular at Hitler himself and Hitler's own personal popularity. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful to you. Signing out now.